Hey everybody, Eric Dorward here with the Spartan Rocketry Club, continuing my build of the Estes Optima Pro. It is time to start finishing this, and the first step I'm going to do anyway is I'm going to use some wood fill. Two reasons. One is I don't need to do as much work with this because these are plywood, but I am going to try to just put a layer on this to seal in the grain a little bit. The grain isn't that bad. The thing that is a little bit more noticeable though is the spiral in the tube. So the spiral is pretty noticeable in this. So I'm going to use some wood fill to cover up the grain as well. So I have most of the rocket. Here's the top part is over here as well. I'm going to fill in the grain for all of this, or at least as much as I can get through in this particular video. So I've taken somewhere around a tablespoon of my wood fill here, and I have mixed it in with just the slightest trace quantities of water, a couple drops, a few milliliters. And I mixed it up, and this is a pretty good consistency, I think, at least for now. I'm going to start with the thin parts, and we'll go from there. The idea is that I just want to paint this stuff on, basically. So I want it to be thin enough so that I can brush paint it on. And I'm just going to cover this as well as I can. All this is going to get sanded. I do want to try to stay, well, there are a couple glops in this, which is probably, I didn't stir this up as well as I conceivably could have. So any of those glops, I want to try to, most of them are wet enough that they should just kind of brush apart. I don't really want to leave them. I'm going to sand this, of course, so it's not that big a deal. Anything that remains behind that's particularly gloppy, well, it's going to get sanded off. It's just a little bit more work that I need to do. You could probably end up skipping this step. I mean, you certainly could. You never need to. It's not really going to affect a whole lot about the rocket's flight characteristics. If anything, I'm adding a slight bit of weight to the rocket by doing this. But mostly this is for aesthetics. I want the fins to be as smooth as possible. That is for aerodynamics, but mostly I just want it to look nice. So that is the main reason. This is actually taking more, I have to say, more wood fill than I expected. I mean, this is obviously, there's a lot of surface area on these fins. But this is actually soaking it up to a surprising degree. I guess I shouldn't have been terribly surprised by that. I'm probably going to end up needing more rather than less of this stuff. But I'll get through as much as I can before I run out and need to make another batch. And that's fine. So you'll notice too that I did the underside of this fin, and now I'm doing the the current face of it. That's just good habit to get into. I seriously doubt it's going to matter on this particular rocket, but if you are painting something that is wet onto any kind of wood, you run the risk of it warping. That's going to warp, especially if you have one side that's wet and one side that isn't. So best practice, I guess, would be to do one side and then immediately do the other. So that way you are, if it's going to warp, it hopefully will warp fairly evenly. The fact that one side is wet is going to counterbalance, or be counterbalanced rather, by the other side that is also wet. That would be ideal here. Hopefully, this plywood is pretty thick, so it's probably not going to warp noticeably no matter how I do this, but there have definitely been some kits that I've made with balsa typically that the wood is very thin. And the thinner the wood, the more likely it is to noticeably warp. A little bit more on this. Yeah, so this amount of wood fill is probably going to go about half as far as I need it to. And that happens. I just underestimated. It's not that big a deal. It just means I need to make more later. The finishing process always takes me very, very much longer than the building process. This kit wasn't super complicated when it came to the build. Maybe it's got more fins than a lot of rockets do. That's certainly true. And the fact that I ended up needing or wanting to use epoxy on it made it more time consuming. But the finishing process always takes way, way longer, at least if you're going to end up painting the rocket. There's certainly kits, and there's nothing wrong with them, that you don't need to paint. And in that case, hey, great, you could put it together in an hour and be ready to fly it right then and there. But virtually all the kits that I build at this point, yeah, they don't fall into that category. If they need to be painted, I figure that's like a week's worth, work right there between. Even if you don't do this step, I find that priming and letting the primer dry completely to the point that I can sand it seems to take the better part of a week. Once you have the fins ready for the final color, that actually goes pretty quickly. But getting them to that point, yeah, that's time consuming. Alright, so I've got most of this done. I'm going to just do one of these little fins just quickly. I did get some epoxy drips on them. So the construction, the last bit, I had to make a second batch of epoxy, and it was fine eventually, but it actually took me a couple tries to get the fin properly attached. It actually slid. I had it in place and I was letting it rest, and it actually slid because the epoxy was not firmly anchored. I was actually, I don't know, I was a little, not impatient, but I didn't really do the world's best job in that particular moment because I had it all standing upright. And it didn't really occur to me that the main fins, they were basically dry and ready to go. But the last little bit I was putting on, the epoxy, it's 5-minute epoxy, and it was in minute 1. So it was not tacking really at all, and I didn't hold it as long as I probably should have. Alright, so I've done 2 out of 3 sets of fins here. The last thing I'm going to do with the wood fill that I have is I'm going to work on the spiral. And I would typically just finish up the last fin, but for the sake of viewing audiences, should there actually be any, I'm going to just go straight into filling in the spiral, because you don't really need to watch all this. Alright, so the spiral in this, there's a really noticeable one, and then there's kind of a thinner one every other pass, more or less. The upper tube doesn't really seem to have that problem. It just seems to be the main one that is the problem. So this piece I think I am actually going to fill in. I'm going to try to fill in as much as possible. So I'm just going to load up a little bit on my brush, and this actually works, I would say, probably better when you're using the freshest mixed batch that you have of this stuff, because you don't need this to be thick. I'm just kind of dabbing it on to where the spiral is, and then I'm going to brush it smoother I'm going to do the junctions in between the fins here first before I do anything else. This really does not take much wood fill, so it's a nice thing to do last as well. So it's like, which one would you rather, which approach would you rather do? You want to do it first when it's nice and thin, or you want to do it last when you're just using up whatever trace quantities you have? It's certainly up to you. But most of the time, again, I don't really feel like this is terribly necessary, but I'm looking for a decent finish, and the spiral in this is really quite noticeable. So anyway, once all this dries, and this stuff dries quite quickly, this is like a half an hour wait or so, then I'm just going to hit this with sandpaper, just like I'm going to sand the fins. I would also sand just kind of right over the body too. Now, if you're doing this, the fact that you have decided that you're going to fill the fins means you absolutely need to sand the body tube, because this is going to look like absolute garbage if you do not sand what you brushed on here. This is not smooth in any way, shape, or form, and it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be filling in gaps. So since that's what it's doing, I'm not trying to get this to be smooth. That's what the sanding's for. So if you just brush this on the tubes and say good enough, it's going to look terrible. It's going to be very inconsistent. All right. Trace quantities left should be. There's a hair stuck in here. That's nice. Should be enough to finish this. The upper part, like I said, that's going to have to get filled in too. Well, it doesn't have to, but I'm going to fill it in as well. And then once I've done that, the upper part's going to be ready for the paint shop. It's going to be ready to prime. When I'm filling in the tube, I just put this stuff on and then sand it. I don't put sanding sealer on it. I put sanding sealer on fins, but I don't generally bother with it if I'm trying to fill in the body tube. One thing that, in looking at this, I've neglected, and I probably should do, is the fins. They need fillets, and I have some options with that. I have used epoxy clay on rockets to make fin fillets. I don't think I'm going to do that for this particular rocket, for a variety of reasons. The fact that it's through the fin construction is nice. I'm basically out of this stuff. I'm just about done, so I'm going to try to scrape my cup clean here, get whatever last quantities of my wood fill I can out of this. So I don't need to, well, I need to make another batch of this anyway, so I guess that's kind of silly, but I do kind of want to finish this job so I don't have to come back to it. Yeah, I'm going to have to. The last little bit here is pretty caked on. Anyway, so the fillets that I'm going to do, I'll do it before I end up priming it, I think, but I'm just going to use wood glue. The epoxy clay, I don't really love it, or more accurately, I don't really love the stuff that I have, because it is kind of hard to work with. You need to wear gloves, obviously, because it's epoxy. The resin is still going to be problematic. And it's fine, you can roll it into a nice snake and then put the snake in the crack, but I have a hard time smoothing it out for whatever reason. I would kind of like a thinner, less viscous clay. Viscous is probably not the right word, but a smoother clay to work with. I'm sure that product exists, but I don't have any, and I would have to special order it, I think. It's not something that I could just pick up at the local supply company. big box supply company like I could do with a lot of the rest of the stuff. So in any event, I've made decent headway. I need to finish the last set of fins, so I need some more wood fill for that, and I need to do the spiral in the upper section, and then it'll be time to continue the process. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next bit.